Dr. Tegan Gleeson is a specialist in classics from the University of New England, and she's come down from Armidale to be with us. Tegan was actually present at our inaugural, well, actually it wasn't quite the inaugural, but our first proper Stoicon in November 2020, which was all online. And we didn't know what we were doing, but somehow it worked, and that's why we're here today. She studies emotions in ancient literature and philosophy with a particular focus on the literary depiction of the Latin concept verecundia, which means respect or shame, in Rome's exemplary past. She has an article forthcoming in Antixon, which is Australian New Zealand Classics Journal, examining consolatory argumentation in Ovid's Tristia, which was developed from a presentation awarded the outstanding postgraduate talk at a meeting of the Australian Society for Classical Studies in 2021. After working as an associate lecturer at the University of Tasmania, Tegan is currently based in Armidale, where she teaches Latin at the University of New England. And she's going to be talking to us today about Seneca's Consolations. So please welcome Tegan Gleeson.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Judy. I'm really touched to have been invited to this event, and I'm so happy to be here and meeting you all. So I'd just like to thank the organisers and thank you all for coming to hear me today, and our other wonderful speakers, of course. So Seneca the Elder, Seneca the Younger rather, was a Roman statesman, a playwright, and most importantly for our meeting today, a Stoic philosopher, as well as philosophical treatises on topics like anger and clemency, and of course his famous letters to Achilles. Seneca also composed 3 Consolations, which are a kind of letter written to offer philosophical comfort after a traumatic event like death or exile. The Consolations are interesting, in part because they're the earliest Senecan writings that have survived for us. And actually his outputs are some of the longest or the biggest body of source material for us studying ancient Stoicism. They're a really interesting blend of public and private, of social and philosophical and literary. Each has a named addressee and a reason for composition. At some point, when Gaius was Rome's emperor, Seneca wrote the Ad Marcium, a consolation addressed to a noblewoman on the death of her son. He died about 3 years earlier, so her grief was considered excessive. During Seneca's exile, now when Claudius was Rome's emperor, Seneca composed 2 more consolations. The first was to his mother Helvia, on the loss of him, his son, when banished to Corsica. And Seneca claims originality in that consolation. He's both the person mourned and the person consoling. The second of these consolations from exile was written to Claudius's freedman, Polybius, on the loss of his brother. Despite on the face of it being written to specific people on their own specific circumstances, these consolations are clearly written with a wider audience in mind. They're published and circulated. The place of these writings within Seneca's very early work shows us that from the beginning of his career, Seneca was interested in and sensitive to the pain caused by death. Even so, the Stoic attitude to death, that it's an unavoidable part of life that is ordained by nature and therefore not something that should cause mental distress, can at times seem heartless and almost cruel to a modern audience. And I'll come back to that towards the end. While Seneca's consolations operate within an overall Stoic framework, they're not a philosophical treatise that expounds doctrine. They're as much literary as they are philosophical. Consolation has been described by Wilson as a philosophically informed written crystallization of a social practice. consolation kind of cuts across genres. They're acts of persuasion that use philosophy to provide psychological medicine to the bereaved. They are an extension of a cultural and a social impulse to offer comfort. Consolation has a very long history. The first was written by Crenter of Soli, so a member of Plato's Academy. And his work on grief combined philosophical reflections on death with exhortations to overcome grief for the very first time. And another modern scholar, Schofield, comments that at least from this time on, consolatory writings can be seen to bear a close relation to, and indeed form a part of, the much broader stream of philosophical literature of ethical exhortation, moral progress, and self-formation. So these consolations have a really long history, and they go back, and they can be traced throughout philosophy and Stoic philosophy in particular. How do we know about these early beginnings? Well, Cicero's Tusculan Disputations gives us the most sustained discussion of what consolation was for a Greek or Roman. He says that there are set words which are said about poverty or life without gaining office or fame or exile or ruin of country, infirmity, basically everything that can be termed a disaster, a calamita. We know, thanks to Cicero's Tusculan Disputations, that the early Stoics, Chrysippus and Cleanthes, were also interested in using philosophical arguments to overcome the mental distress that is caused by loss. Now, as you may well know, from the founding of the Stoa, the Stoics differentiated between things that are good, things that are bad, and things that don't matter, which is everything else, things that are called indifferents. Now, virtue and things related to virtue are the only good. Vice and things related to vice are bad, and everything else, prosperity or poverty, sickness or health, were considered indifferent. Soon, though, a distinction was made. This seemed like a little bit too tough a pill to swallow. So a distinction was made between preferred indifferents that are more valuable to us, like prosperity or health, and non-preferred indifferents that are less valuable, like poverty or sickness. So it's a bit too hard a line to combine these kind of very opposite things in one basket of doesn't matter. So according to Cicero, the very early Greek Stoic, Cleanthes, he took a really hard line on this place of death, on this spectrum of good, indifferent, and bad or evil. So when Cleanthes offered consolation, he thought it was best to concentrate his efforts on convincing a mourner that death isn't a bad thing at all. It's not an evil. For a person actually experiencing grief, this approach probably wasn't all that helpful. It's not hard to imagine why being told that something traumatic isn't traumatic, no matter how well he's reasoned it, might not offer any kind of solace. Following Cleanthes, Chrysippus took a bit of a more flexible view. He thought that the more effective mode of consolation was actually just to eradicate the person's belief that mourning is an appropriate response to losing a loved one. He didn't debate whether losing them was a bad thing in the first place. He just dealt with whether mourning was a proper reaction to that probably traumatic event. Cicero would then write a consolation to himself, which we've lost, probably for the best, in that he was very kind of obnoxiously proud of it. And he would combine various approaches. And so you can see that there was a lot of debate in the ancient world about what the best way was to deal with grief. Because death is a universal experience across time, space, and culture, it's really tempting to think that the attitudes and the responses and the practices regarding death are also universal. Like all emotions, though, grief is attached to a culture's specific values. So several years ago, when my pop was in a coma, we had family come from across the state We sat vigil by his bedside in hospital. We shared stories about his life. After his death, we had a non-religious memorial in the local church. We read poetry, played music. We gathered at the local RSL afterwards. We had drinks, nibbles, overlooking the Clarence River, and kind of enjoyed the company of family. That would have been totally foreign to a Roman. The focus today tends to be on talking and sharing, seeking therapy, working through these really complex feelings on a personal level. But for the Romans, for Seneca's audience, grief was socially disruptive. It was dangerous. It caused people to withdraw and stop playing their important roles in society. Seneca's Consolations are often criticised for being harsh and they've been described as not palatable to modern sensitivity. And this is because we're acclimatised to this non-judgmental and empathetic grief therapy. So Seneca opens his earliest consolation, the Ad Marcium, by saying that he aims to do battle with Marcia's grief. And the military metaphor is certainly appropriate. What his consolations try to do is to persuade the addressee to correct their erroneous judgments about death, to re-educate the addressee in virtue, and encourage them to reintegrate themselves in society. What they are not is a safe space to talk through feelings and emotions. Okay, so there's quite a lot of difference between modern mourning and ancient consolations. We've got to acknowledge that distance, but personally, I think that we can still relate to, we can still find relevance in ancient theories and accounts of death. And one way that we can do that, and why we're here today, is to find this relevance by reading the Consolations with a focus on the application of Stoic philosophy to treat disturbing emotions. We can do it by appreciating that Seneca's a literary philosopher. His consolations are presented as consolations. They're written to real and living people. So what I'd like to do is talk about the way that Seneca applies this Stoic framework on 3 different levels across the 3 consolations. He treats his addressees as humans on the first level. He also treats them as humans of a specific gender, and he treats them as unique individuals. Seneca makes it pretty explicit through his consolations. The Stoic idea that grief is a choice, it's a decision. And because grief is a choice, Seneca can correct it using rhetoric and philosophy. Emotions are a product of a faulty value judgment about an external circumstance and what is appropriate. We don't have control over that external circumstance. We don't have control over whether our lost one is with us, has died or is alive. But we do have control over the judgments we make about that loss. So I was thinking about this, and this is not at all based on a real story. If I come home to find a huge, massive spider on my kitchen floor, if I decide that that spider is a source of danger, I am going to decide it's appropriate to experience fear, which I did. If my boyfriend comes home and sees a spider on the kitchen floor and he decides, sweet little arachnid, just trying to live its best life, he's not going to experience mental disturbance. My housemate and I just screamed a lot and tried to get it out and threw away the cup involved in the process. Now, for the Stoics, rational arguments, the remedy. If I can be convinced that spiders are not agents of death on 8 legs, I'll no longer believe that fear is an appropriate response. The emotion won't occur in the first place. It is wrong to think that events outside our control, like the presence of a nasty spider in my clean kitchen, is a serious evil. So the response is irrational. This Stoic understanding of emotions underpins Seneca's consolations. He's quite clear about the relationship between belief and emotion. So Marcia's grief, and her son died 3 years ago and she won't stop grieving. Seneca diagnoses it. It arose from her view that death is an evil, this faulty assumption, and it transformed this natural spark of longing to see someone who isn't there into a relentless habit, a self-perpetuated habit. Because Marcia's grief is an opinio, it's an active decision over which she has control. She has chosen to cling on to her grief for 3 years, according to Seneca. She can therefore be convinced to stop doing so with persuasion, with argument. Similarly, Seneca tells his mother Helvia, so he's been exiled and he's writing back to Helvia at Rome, and he treats his mother's supposed grief at this same root level of mistaken assumptions. He says, I myself will show you that I am not unhappy, so that you're not troubled by unfounded belief. Helvia might still miss Seneca, but she just won't be upset by thinking he's miserable in exile. Seneca has to find this balance between treating his addressees as independent moral agents and his belief as a Stoic that death is a law of nature. And we need to live in accordance with nature if we want to find happiness. So in his Consolations to Marcia and Polybius, Seneca reminds them that the person that they mourn was always going to die. We find this argument elsewhere throughout the consolatory tradition. So the Consolatio ad Apollonium, which is ascribed to Plutarch, probably just imitating him, not actually written by him, will say explicitly that too much grief is contrary to nature. So by presenting death as a product of nature, Seneca is trying to realign his audience's beliefs about death, correcting this faulty assumption that death is bad. It can't be bad because it's part of nature. And this link between nature and life and death is fundamental to all of his consolations. In the Ad Marcians, Seneca presents death as a corollary to birth. And this is going to sound harsh. He says to Marcia, if you grieve the death of your son, the blame goes back to when he was born. For his death was proclaimed at his birth. Into this condition he was begotten. This fate attended him straight away from the womb. The law of birth, this lex nascendi, stipulates that we are mortal, that one day we're going to die. Grief is an objection to the laws of nature. Marcia's grief has even failed to succumb to time itself, which Seneca pointedly describes as a natural remedy, a naturale remedium. And the concept is so important that Seneca gives voice to natura using this rhetorical technique called prosopopia. It's this imagined speech in which an abstract entity, so nature, speaks. So Seneca's Ad Marcium, nature says to us all, I deceive no one. If you raise sons, prepare yourself for the task of having to cremate them as a young boy or a youth or an old man. The words are harsh because the facts are harsh, and they're made more harsh by the fact that nature is giving this lesson. But the implication is pretty clear. It is irrational and it's inappropriate to complain of laws that Marcia has agreed to by giving birth to a mortal son from her womb. But in that Ad Plebeium, Seneca presents this relationship between life and death, humans and nature, as a transaction. Nature gave Polybius a brother. It's not a permanent possession, it's a loan. Just as Polybius shouldn't think it's unfair when a debtor asks to be paid back, so too must he not think it unfair when nature asks for what is hers to be returned. And Seneca wonders, I know not whether it is more foolish to be ignorant of the law of mortality or more presumptuous to refuse to obey it. Okay, so grief is either ignorance, that everyone has to die, or it's a rebellion against the facts of life. So Seneca is arguing. So someone who presumes that their loved ones are somehow exempt from this law, they must be vain or arrogant. Seneca presents this idea a little bit more positively in that Helvium. He says, a person who regards death as the law of nature instead of a kind of punishment won't fear death and actually will be fortified against other types of fear. This haughty belief that you can defy nature, a belief that's the cause of emotional suffering because it's universal, can be capitalized upon to treat grief. Epictetus would actually suggest later, and this one's brutal, to conceptualize your child as an earthenware jug or a glass wine cup. It can break at any moment, and he suggests reminding them that they're mortal, which probably isn't in child-rearing books today. By arguing that death is an essential part of nature, Seneca connects his addressees with a long history of humans who have loved and lost. And Seneca says this explicitly. To Polybius, he says, a man will find the greatest comfort in the thought that what has befallen him was suffered by all before him. And nature has made universal what she's made hardest to bear, in order that the uniformity of fate might console men for its cruelty. Okay, so death sucks, but it sucks for everyone, and always has and always will. Now, this idea that others have suffered before you and will suffer after you is pretty common in consolation. It's a technique called non-tibi soli. It's not for you alone. Ancient philosophers disagreed about whether this is actually a useful strategy. According to Cicero, Chrysippus often got in trouble for citing this passage from the playwright Euripides, which says, death is the end for all. And you can see why that might get annoying if he just says that every time someone's upset. Apparently, it's pretty painful to remind someone that we are all subject to such a cruel necessity. But clearly, Seneca thought that this type of consolatory argument had value, and for my part, I think it does. It seems that he found this value by linking the universality of death to nature, because above all, we have to live in accordance with nature. Seneca also uses nature to show his mother Helvia that his exile isn't a source of suffering. He compares his exile to this inevitable and continuous movement of planets through the heavens. They're also governed by a law, a lex, and the necessity of nature. Humans are made of the same materials as the planets, according to Stoic physics. And because the planets find joy in their movement, so too does Seneca. He doesn't need to be troubled by his movement away from home, no more than a planet is troubled by its movement. A key part of Seneca's argument is that specific places aren't important for a Stoic wise man. Nature's the same wherever you go. Changing place isn't that important. Wherever you go, you're going to find the same laws of nature. And nature has equipped everyone with what they need for happiness, because external things don't matter. So Seneca says to his mother that nature intended that we should need no great equipment for living happily. Each one of us can make his own happiness. So when Helvia is able to understand that her son isn't suffering, she can understand that grief over his misfortune is not appropriate. It doesn't exist. Okay. So far, I've discussed the way that Seneca presents death as a condition of life. It's demanded by nature. And he uses this to try to convince his addressees to stop grieving. We've also established that Seneca treats his three addressees as humans. They're bound by their mortality. He also treats them as rational agents. They're familiar with and they're responsive to philosophical ideas. Now, this is noteworthy because two of the three addressees are women. And we don't know much about the role of women in Stoic philosophy. So we've got limited amount of theory about women's place. Musonius Rufus argues, at least, that women have the same capacity for virtue and the same need of virtue as men. And he will conclude that without philosophy, no woman, just like no man, would be educated, and that philosophy is required for a woman's moral development. Seneca openly discusses Marcia and Helvia's capacity for virtue as women. He deals with it. But to do it, he actually said that they're not like other women. So kind of interestingly, he opens at Marcia by saying that he wouldn't dare to treat Marcia's grief unless he knew that she had distanced herself from, and I quote, womanly weakness of mind. Similarly, Seneca points to his mother's proven capacity for virtuous behaviour, which is devoid of the failings typical of women. He says to her, the excuse of womanhood isn't able to touch one from whom all womanly vices are absent. It might seem a bit paradoxical for Seneca to say he can console these women because they're not like other women. But what we're actually seeing is Seneca grappling with the problem of applying Latin virtue language. It's inherently gendered. In a Roman society, in a patriarchal Roman society, male, and I'm kind of big scare quotes, male qualities were regarded as superior to female qualities, and negative values were described as intrinsically feminine. So Seneca will rebuke Polybius by asking, but what is so lowly and womanly as giving yourself over to be consumed by grief? So Seneca's Consolations are interesting. They show us a philosopher trying really seriously to deal with grief, to deal with the grief of women and how to actually deal with this on a philosophical level, given that all of the language available to him is gendered this way, that is, women's grief is bad. You know, he can use it to have a go at Polybius and say, man up. So Seneca can't tell Marcia and Helvia, stop acting like women. They are women. Instead, he sets them apart. They're exceptions to the norm. He links them with other exceptional women, and this status is part of their capacity for future virtue. One of my favourite bits of that in Marcium is when he deals with Marcia's potential objection straight out. He says, I know what you're going to say. You forget you're consoling a woman. You're citing examples of men. And he replies to this imagined objection. He said, but who has said that nature has dealt badly with the intellects of women and has narrowed their virtues? Believe me, they have as much strength, as much capacity, if you like, for virtuous actions. They endure grief and toil equally if they are accustomed to do so. Helvia and Marcia as women are part of nature, and nature has made it so that their woman's ingenia, their innate inner quality, can endure hardship and show virtue. And with practice, they can do it just as well as men. Seneca is able to conceptualize Marcia and Helvia as a human. They're bound by the rules of nature. They're also a human bound to a particular gender, and they've been given equal capacity for virtue. His attempts to establish Marcia and Helvia as women who can benefit from consolation demonstrate a really conscious and pointed effort to conceptualize both genders as moral agents. And I think the fact that he attempts to do so is really significant, even though it sounds really like very black and white on the face of it. He's really seriously trying to deal with this. And I think that intent is important. Okay, but how does he treat them as an individual? Stoicism provides space for the particularities of each moral agent, their character, their identity. Our best source for this is Cicero's De Officiis on duties, and he adapts this or translates this from Panaetius's persona theory. So Cicero says we should realise that we're clothed, as it were, by nature with two personae. The first is our role as a rational human being. We're capable of moral improvement. And we've seen how Seneca addresses this role by linking life and death with nature. But the other part, the other persona that we must play is our role as individuals, our unique character. Seneca draws on the unique characters of his addressees throughout the Consolation. And this is something that I find really personal, something I really like about it. You get a sense of who he's trying to talk to. And he does it by telling them very frequently that their grief isn't in accordance with their mores, with their habits, with their customs. So one way that we see Seneca considering this role is his treatment of whether literature can help in curing grief. We see that literature has the capacity to do just this in all three consolations. But what he recommends to each addressee is quite different. Now, Marcia is the daughter of a famously censored historian, Tremutius Cordus. His books were ordered to be burned, which is kind of admirable, I think. She was actively involved in republishing his father's history after it had been ordered to be burned. So she saved a copy and she then republished it when it was safe to do so. Seneca makes a big deal about how significant this is. It's an outstanding deed for Roman academic pursuits. It's an outstanding deed for later generations, he says. And Marcia's earlier virtue is aligned with this act of restoration. She's proven that she's had the capacity to endure loss. But with the death of her son, literature is apparently useless. Seneca says that he actually only decided to write the Consolation after all other comforts were effective, including literary pursuits. And he describes them as a paternal inheritance. They come from her father as a historian. Apparently, literature now finds Marcia's ears closed and affords her a futile consolation. Scarcely engages her thoughts for a minute. And literature as a consolation has a pretty vexed tradition. In the late Republic, Cicero wrote to a friend who's apparently really troubled of mind, and he presents himself as an exemplar, a model of using learning to distract the mind from anxiety. He says these studies could be useful and delightful in the height of prosperity, but now we have nothing else to ease our hearts. And his whole point is that you should do what I do, which is read. A year later, though, Cicero loses his own daughter and kind of shows himself to be a bit hypocritical. He admits that writing is useless. It's actually making his grief worse. And this is something that you see a lot in Cicero's Consolations, the idea that it's good in theory, but applying it to different story. And he kind of exposes that through his own experiences of loss. But what's failed to comfort Marcia is recommended to Polybius. He urges the historian to engage with literature. He recommends Virgil or Horace. And then he suggests that he write a history of Claudius's principate, of Claudius's empire. There's obviously an element of panegyric here. Seneca plays for Claudius as a suitable object for history, and Seneca's trying to get back from exile, right? So he's like, write a history about great esteemed emperor. It'll help. But towards the end of the Consolation, Seneca comes back to this idea, and he also presents writing as a way of defending his mind against the intrusion of grief. He says, bury yourself more deeply in your studies, encircle yourself with them as a defense for your mind, so that sorrow may find no point that will give entrance to you. In his Consolation to Helvia, we find the most detailed discussion of the merits of literature, specifically of philosophy, as a way to console oneself. He starts by saying that none of the passions associated with grief are being obedient. They're overbearing and obstinate, and they're rejecting all remedies. Seneca acknowledges that will and determination aren't key for Helvia to overcome her grief. Nor are distractions like public spectacles, gladiatorial shows, or travel, or account keeping, which I don't think it would help my grief, estate management, or other such tasks. So Seneca says none of those work. It's better, therefore, to conquer it than to cheat it. For a grief that has been deceived and driven away by pleasure or by business rises again. And its period of rest gives it strength for a more terrible attack. But a grief that has been conquered by reason, by ratio, is appeased forever. And I think that that links in really nicely with what Donald was saying about Epicureanism versus Stoicism, and the idea that you can't just suppress something, extract it, you can't just watch the gladiators fight, you have to deal with it. So Seneca, unsurprisingly, suggests philosophy to his mother. Apparently, Helvia didn't have much access to philosophy before. Seneca's father, the older Seneca, had old-fashioned strictness and only let her dabble a little bit in philosophy. Apparently, she was really, really sensitive to philosophy, though. If she had been allowed to engage with it, Seneca says that actually Helvia would be consoling him, not the other way around. And she picked up a lot, apparently, during her studies. He says, thanks to your intellectual appetite, you learned more than one could have expected in that time. Okay. Apparently, where are we? Am I going ahead for time? Yeah, easy. Yeah, cool. Okay. So Seneca deals with whether literature can help differently depending on who he's consulting. I'd now like to just ask briefly, how can we apply these views? We've said that they look a bit harsh. And if I said at my granddad's wake, everyone who is born has to die, I'm probably not going to be invited back. So the kinds of things that are appropriate to say in the face of death are culturally constructed. This kind of stiff upper lip approach that we heard about earlier, it's what's made Stoicism seem a bit less attractive. But I've actually slowly found this idea actually a helpful one, that everyone must die. About 12 months ago, my little miniature nephew, Tegan Gleeson, she's naughty, was diagnosed with diabetes, and I've spent the last 12 months injecting her twice a day with insulin and feeling really grateful at each injection. It means I get an extra 12 hours with her. There's a kind of peace in it for me now. I'll have to get back to you on whether I find that helpful when she does actually die, whenever that is. But I genuinely find it helpful to think that her life is on loan to me. And I think the act of giving her insulin really reminds me of that. Like I literally keep her alive for 12 hours. I thought she was going to die. She didn't. She pulled through. So now I'm just grateful that the loan's term has been extended, one dose at a time, and that I get to make the most of our time together. So I didn't think I would, but with time I found comfort in that idea. When she does pass, Seneca's Consolations show me that the way that I process my grief will depend on me as a unique individual. Reading might help, it might not. For some people, losing a dog is kind of a tragedy. For me, it's going to be pretty brutal. It's going to be like losing a bit of me. And I need to honor that. I need to find ways to manage my grief that if it worked for me as a complex human being. Probably going to need to convince my partner that I need another miniature schnauzer. So treating your own grief has to involve knowing yourself, and that's what makes emotions so difficult to process. You have to confront yourself. And finally, Seneca's Consolations remind me that we've been struggling with emotions that feel insurmountable for a really long time. Through Seneca's attempts to heal people, the grief of people dead 2,000 years ago, personally I have a framework that I can adapt. It's kind of conceptual safe space to think about the nature of death and of loss, of humanity and mortality. It reminds me that one's not alone in facing loss, and this is what drew me to the Consolations in the first place. I'm part of a long tradition of birth and death, non-Soli Tibi. You're not alone. Thank you.